The smell of slow-cooked beef filled my little house that Sunday evening when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I wiped my hands on an old towel and looked at the screen. It was a message from my son. Running about 20 minutes late, Dad. Traffic near the bridge. Save me some dinner. I smiled. I had been checking the oven every few minutes, even though there was absolutely no reason to. The roast had been cooking for hours, and I knew it was ready. My name is Walter Bennett. I was 70 years old that spring. For most of my working life, I had been a railway mechanic. I spent nearly 4 decades repairing engines, fixing electrical systems, and coming home with grease under my fingernails. I retired 7 years ago after my wife Eleanor passed away. We had been married for 43 years. After she died, I couldn't stand living in the old family house. Every room seemed to contain a memory. Her slippers were beside the bed. Her favorite mug was still in the kitchen cabinet. Even the hallway smelled faintly of the lavender soap she used. So I sold the house and moved into a modest bungalow on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, Oregon. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, small kitchen, tiny garden, a garage that was mostly filled with things I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But it was home. I had 2 children. My son was Nathan Bennett, 44 years old. Everyone called him Nate. He had built a successful career in technology and had made more money than I could ever understand. He lived about an hour away in a large modern house overlooking the river. My daughter was Claire, 41. Claire had married Daniel Harper, and they had an 8-year-old son named Oliver. Oliver was the light of my life. That Sunday evening was supposed to be an ordinary family dinner. It wasn't. It became the night I discovered that the people closest to you can sometimes hide the biggest secrets from you. Nate arrived first. He came through the front door carrying a bottle of wine, hugged me, and immediately complained about the traffic. About 20 minutes later, Claire arrived with Daniel and Oliver. Oliver ran straight past his mother and jumped into my arms. Grandpa! I laughed and lifted him off the ground. Easy, young man. I'm getting too old for this. You're not old. That's because you're 8. Everyone laughed. We sat around the dining table. The roast turned out perfectly. The potatoes were soft, the carrots were sweet, and I had made the gravy exactly the way Eleanor used to make it. For a while, everything felt normal. Nate talked about a business trip. Daniel listened quietly. Claire kept reminding Oliver to eat his vegetables. I remember looking around that table and thinking how lucky I was. Then Nate put down his fork. Dad, he said, can I ask you something? Sure. Why are you still living here? I frowned. What do you mean? He looked confused. I mean this house. I thought you were planning to move. I've never said that. Nate laughed nervously. Dad, come on. I don't know what you're talking about. He stared at me for a few seconds. Then he said something that changed everything. I bought you a house last year. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. What? The house in Maple Ridge. I stared at him. What house? His smile disappeared. The house on Willow Creek Road. I shook my head. Nate, I've never heard of it. He looked at Claire. And that was when I noticed something. My daughter had gone completely pale. She was staring down at her plate. Nate slowly turned toward her. Claire? She didn't answer. Claire, what is Dad talking about? Daniel suddenly became very still. I looked from one face to another. Nate, I said, I think you've made some kind of mistake. No. He pulled out his phone. I bought the house for you last December. He opened his banking application. I sent Claire the money because she said she'd handle everything. She said you wanted a quiet place with a garden. My stomach tightened. How much money? He looked at me. $860,000. The room went silent. I stared at my daughter. She still wouldn't look at me. Nate continued. I sent the money to Claire. She sent me pictures of the house. She said you loved it. I felt something cold move through my chest. I never saw those pictures. Nate's face changed. What? I never saw a house. He looked at Claire. Claire, what did you do? My daughter suddenly pushed her chair backward. It scraped loudly against the floor. I'm sorry, she whispered. Then she stood up. Claire? She grabbed her coat. I'm sorry, Dad. She rushed toward the door. Daniel followed her. Claire, wait! The front door slammed. A few seconds later, I heard their car start. Then they were gone. Nate and I remained at the table. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he turned his phone toward me. There were bank records. December 19th, $860,000. Transfer to Claire Harper. Memo, Dad's new house. Then he showed me messages. Claire had sent him photographs of a beautiful farmhouse. It had a wide wooden porch, white windows, an enormous maple tree in the front yard, and a little stone path leading to the door. She had written, Dad is going to love this. Another message said he cried when he saw it. I stared at the photographs. I had never seen that house. I had never held those keys. I had never stood on that porch. I had spent Christmas in my little bungalow. Claire had told me she was visiting Daniel's parents that year. Nate sat back in his chair. Dad, I swear I had no idea. I believe you. I'll fix this. I nodded, but I didn't know what fixing this meant. Nate stayed until nearly midnight. He called Claire several times. No answer. He called Daniel. Daniel eventually answered. They spoke for less than a minute. When Nate hung up, he looked exhausted. Daniel says Claire isn't ready to talk. I stared at the untouched food. Neither am I. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off. I kept thinking about my daughter. Claire had always been the responsible one. When she was a little girl, she once found a $20 bill outside a grocery store. She came running to me. Dad, someone lost this. I told her we should try to find the owner. We couldn't, so I suggested giving it to someone who needed it. She walked over to an elderly man sitting outside the store and handed him the money. That was the Claire I remembered. Kind, honest, compassionate. So, how had that little girl become a woman who could take nearly $1 million and lie to her entire family? The next morning, I called my old friend Raymond. Raymond and I had worked together on the railway for more than 30 years. He was the kind of man who could look at a complicated problem and immediately start separating it into smaller pieces. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, Get dressed. Why? Because we're finding that house. An hour later, Raymond picked me up. We drove toward Maple Ridge. The address was 218 Willow Creek Road. When we reached the neighborhood, I immediately understood why Nate had chosen it. The house was beautiful. It sat behind a low stone wall. There were roses beneath the windows. A wooden swing hung from the porch. The place looked peaceful. It looked like something Eleanor and I would have loved. I stared at it through the windshield. Raymond got out of the car. Stay here. Where are you going? To ask a question. Before I could stop him, he walked across the street. He rang the bell. A woman answered. They spoke for several minutes. Then Raymond returned. Well? She's renting it. I felt my throat tighten. Renting. She's been living there for almost a year. Who owns it? Raymond looked at me. Your daughter. I closed my eyes. Take me to a lawyer. That afternoon, Raymond took me to an attorney named Marcus Hale. Marcus listened carefully. He asked questions. He reviewed the documents Nate had provided. Then he said, Before we decide what happens next, we need to understand why this happened. I told him I wanted answers. Not revenge, not punishment. Answers. Marcus agreed to investigate quietly. The next week felt endless. Nate called every morning. He never asked what I was doing. He simply said, Love you, Dad. Claire sent messages. The first said, Dad, I'm sorry. The second said, Please talk to me. The third said, You deserve to know the truth. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. Then Marcus called. Walter, I think you should come in. I drove to his office. He placed a folder in front of me. The house on Willow Creek Road had been purchased for $848,000. It had been paid for in cash. The property was registered under Claire's name, not mine. There was no mortgage on it. The house was being rented for nearly $4,500 a month. The rental payments went into a small company Claire had created shortly after purchasing the property. Marcus looked at me. There's more. He opened another file. It contained medical records. Daniel's medical records. I read the first page, then the second, then the third. Daniel had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia more than a year earlier. My hands started shaking. He had been undergoing an experimental treatment at a cancer center in another state. The treatment was extremely expensive. Insurance had covered part of it, but not enough. The total cost had reached hundreds of thousands of dollars. I looked at Marcus. How much? Approximately $690,000. I stared at the papers. Is he alive? Yes. Is the treatment working? Marcus nodded. According to the latest records, he's in remission. I leaned back. Everything looked different. The weight loss, the tiredness, the sweaters, the way Daniel had barely touched his dinner. I had noticed all of it. I simply hadn't understood. Marcus continued. There's another part. Claire had borrowed money against her own home. More than $300,000. She had used those funds for medical expenses. Then she had used the money your son gave her to purchase the Willow Creek property. The rental income was being used to repay debts. I sat silently. So she didn't simply spend the money. No, she bought an asset. Yes, she was trying to recover the money. That appears to be the case. I looked down at the documents. It didn't make what she had done right. But suddenly I understood the desperation behind it. Claire had made a terrible decision. But it wasn't a decision made because she wanted a luxury house. It was made because her husband was dying. And she had been terrified. I went home that evening and cried. Not because of the money, because my daughter had been carrying all of this alone. She could have called me. She could have called Nate. She could have said, Daniel is sick. We need help. But she hadn't. 2 days later, I called her. She answered immediately. Dad? Come over. There was silence. Are you sure? Yes. Should I bring Daniel? No. Should I bring Oliver? No. Just come. She arrived 40 minutes later. When she walked through the door, she looked exhausted. She sat across from me. I said, start at the beginning. And she did. Daniel's diagnosis had come 14 months earlier. The doctors had explained the options. The standard treatment was affordable, but had poor results. The experimental treatment offered a much better chance, but it cost an enormous amount. Daniel had refused at first. He told Claire he didn't want to destroy the family's future. He said they had a child. He said they needed to think about Oliver. Claire refused to accept it. She promised she would find a way. She considered asking Nate several times, but she couldn't do it. She remembered something Nate had once said at Thanksgiving. He had complained about people constantly asking him for money. Sometimes, he had said, I don't know if people love me or just love what I can give them. Claire remembered those words. She became afraid. She didn't want to become another person asking her brother for money. Then she remembered something else. Nate had been planning to buy me a house. He had talked about it for months. He wanted it to be a surprise. He told Claire he trusted her judgment and wanted her to help him find the perfect place. That was when she made the decision. She would take the money temporarily. She would pay for Daniel's treatment. She would buy the house as promised. Then she would rent it. Eventually, she would replace the money. She thought she could keep everything under control. She couldn't. The medical bills kept coming. Daniel's treatment took longer than expected. The rental income wasn't enough. And every month, Claire told herself, next month I'll tell them. Next month never came. I listened. When she finished, she was crying. Dad, she said, I know what I did was wrong. I didn't answer. I know I betrayed Nate. Still nothing. I know I lied to you. She wiped her eyes. But Daniel is alive. That sentence stayed in the room. She continued. Oliver still has his father. Then she whispered, I didn't know how to choose between being honest and saving my family. I looked at her. You didn't have to choose. She looked confused. You could have asked for help. She lowered her head. I was ashamed. I understood that. But I also knew shame could destroy families if you allowed it to become silence. I told Claire there would be consequences. 3 things. First, she had to tell Nate everything. No excuses, no edited version, no hiding the details. Second, the house on Willow Creek Road had to be sold. Every dollar that could be recovered would go back to Nate. Third, Claire had to come to dinner every Sunday. Not because I had forgiven her, not because everything was normal, but because families don't rebuild trust by avoiding each other. They rebuild it by sitting across the table and telling the truth. Claire agreed. That evening, she called Nate. He didn't answer the first time, or the second, or the third. He answered the fourth. They spoke for almost 2 hours. I didn't hear the conversation. I didn't want to. It belonged to them. Later, Nate came to my house. He looked angry. He looked hurt. But he wasn't cruel. I wanted to hate her, he said. I know. I still do sometimes. That may take time. He nodded. Then he said, I'm not pressing charges. I looked at him. Are you sure? No. He took a breath. But Oliver didn't do anything wrong. That was his reason. Not forgiveness, not forgetting. Oliver. The house went on the market. It sold several months later. After taxes, commissions, and closing expenses, Nate recovered most of what he had given Claire. He wanted me to keep the money. I refused. Instead, he created an education account for Oliver. Claire continued paying her remaining debts. Daniel recovered slowly. His hair grew back. He gained weight. He returned to work part-time. Most importantly, his medical scans remained clear. Sunday dinners became our new tradition. Every Sunday, Claire arrived. Sometimes she brought dessert. Sometimes she brought the same lemon cookies she had always brought me. Sometimes she barely spoke. Sometimes we talked for hours. Nate came when he could. Daniel came too. Oliver sat at the table, usually talking more than everyone else combined. And slowly, painfully, things began to change. Not back to the way they had been. Something different, something more honest. Claire never asked me to forget. She never said, but I had a good reason. She simply accepted that what she had done had consequences. One evening, almost 2 years after everything happened, Claire was washing dishes in my kitchen. I stood in the doorway watching her. She turned around. Dad? Yes? Do you forgive me? I thought about it. I don't know, she nodded. I understand. And I may never forgive what you did completely. I understand. But I love you. She smiled sadly. I love you too. That was enough for that night. Later, after everyone had left, I went into my bedroom. I opened an old wooden box that belonged to Eleanor. Inside was a photograph. I hadn't seen it in years. It showed Claire as a little girl. She was standing outside a grocery store. In her hand was a $20 bill. She was giving it to an elderly stranger. I stared at that photograph for a long time. That little girl and the woman who stole from her brother were the same person. That was the hardest lesson of the whole experience. People aren't one thing. My daughter wasn't simply a thief. She wasn't simply a loving mother. She wasn't simply a dishonest woman. She wasn't simply a brave wife. She was all of those things. Human beings can hold contradictions inside themselves. Good people can make terrible choices. And terrible choices don't automatically erase every good thing a person has ever done. But neither does a good reason make a bad action right. Claire saved her husband's life. She also betrayed her brother. Both things were true. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant pretending the betrayal never happened. Now, I don't believe that. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean removing consequences. It doesn't mean trusting someone exactly as you did before. Sometimes forgiveness simply means deciding that someone's worst decision will not be the final definition of who they are. Claire earned back some of my trust slowly, one Sunday at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one dinner at a time. And maybe that's what family really is. Not people who never hurt each other. Not people who never make mistakes, but people who are willing to sit at the same table after the mistake has been made. People who are willing to hear the truth. People who are willing to admit when they were wrong. And sometimes people who are willing to say, I don't forgive you yet, but I'm still here. Years later, I still think about that house on Willow Creek Road. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if Nate had never asked that question. Maybe Claire would have eventually confessed. Maybe she would have paid the money back. Maybe the secret would have remained buried for another decade. I'll never know. What I do know is this: the house was never really the problem. The money wasn't really the problem either. The real problem was silence. Claire was afraid to ask for help. Nate was unaware that his sister was struggling. I was unaware that my daughter was falling apart. Three people who loved each other were sitting in different rooms, each carrying a different version of the same problem. And because nobody spoke honestly, the problem grew. That's how families break. Not always through one enormous betrayal. Sometimes it happens through hundreds of small silences. A phone call you don't make. A truth you postpone. A question you are afraid to ask. A problem you convince yourself you can solve alone. Claire once told me she wished she had asked for help the day Daniel was diagnosed. I told her something I've learned since then. Being strong doesn't mean carrying everything yourself. She looked at me. Then what does being strong mean? I said, knowing when you need someone else. Oliver is older now. Sometimes he sits beside me in the garden. He asks questions about everything. One day he asked me, Grandpa, why do grow?